model where you vaccinate every year. And at least another, and I don't know how much modeling's been done, but in other modeling exercises for example, dengue, we find that if you do that, you start interfering, obviously, with the natural immunity that you would get if you hadn't vaccinated. And I don't know how the natural immunity wanes compared to vaccine-induced, but you could get into a situation where 20, 30 years down the pipe, you get worse epidemics because you've completely altered the buildup of immunity in the population that leads to some balance. I'm wondering if you've thought about that or looked at that with modeling. Yeah.
I'm not sure anybody's looked at the modeling for seasonal malaria, because this is a relatively new idea. I mean, Matt mentioned rebound, and you will get rebound with any malaria intervention if transmission persists and your effect wears off. I mean, I sometimes get a bit cross with sort of people make a big issue of this because it's inevitable that will happen. What you're hoping is that during that period, as a result of your other interventions, the risk will go down. If it doesn't, you will get that. And this applies to seasonal malaria chemoprevention. There is only one study that's really done this, which we did in the Gambia many, many years ago. And there were a few children who had seasonal malaria chemoprevention from 3 months to 5 years of age. Then it stopped. They got more malaria in the next year. The year after, they'd come back to normal, and there weren't more deaths. I think we've seen in this study with RTSS in Kalifi the same thing. I mean, they got protection for 4 years. The effect of the vaccine wore off, and because the transmission was still high, they got more disease. So I think we have to handle that.
Yeah.
Somehow that will happen.
Right, but if you're vaccinating every year, then you may make it worse.
I mean, so what you're hoping is that you save the lives of those young children. For chemoprevention now, people are getting Senegal, they're going up to 10 years old. So the 11-year-olds and 12-year-olds will be at more risk if you do that for that time, and the level of transmission hasn't come down. But perhaps you need to be aware of that. Make absolutely sure they have a new bed net. They're older, can complain, and so on. So we'll have to manage that.
Yeah. A follow-up to that is if you're vaccinating every year, you start building up immunity to the vaccine, so you're not going to get a good take.
Well, that's an important point with RTSS, because the booster, after the booster at 18 months, they didn't get such high antibody levels as they did after the prime. And that's different from like a pneumococcal conjugate or something, which will go right up. And so I think we don't understand what is actually going on there. They've got some memory because they get a better response than if you just give one dose, you don't get it. But it's not the same sort of memory that you get with the conjugate vaccines. And there's work going on now, I think, which is showing that actually malaria down-regulates the response. And you might actually get a better booster response in a non-immune American. And you're right, that's a worry. So if we did it each year and it just went down getting less and less, that would not be an approach.
The curious thing there is that this is a fusion between this repeat region and the C-terminus of the circumsporozoite and hepatitis B. And if you look at the immune response to hepatitis B, it looks like a classic amnestic response, a very, very large boost. But in the same vaccine, you didn't see that through the RTSS clone, which is really...
I mean, it did boost, but not as much.
And then we'll...
Yeah, it seemed to me that the two presentations were a little contradictory. So, of course, it seemed as if the cost-effectiveness studies that you presented that had been done, looked at routine implementation in EPI and kind of recommended that was cost-effective. It seemed it would save a lot of lives. And then Brian was more like, it can't be used like that. We need to look at specific elimination issues. So how are we going to interpret this?
Thank you. So first of all, a disclaimer: I'm not a modeler, and I appreciate the modeling experts in the group. But the models that I reviewed are based on implementation of RTSS and the EPI schedule. But like Brian said, I agree, we need to consider use of this vaccine out of the EPI schedule and consider it for use when it would be optimal and when it would make most sense for a country to implement it. So if that means instead of vaccinating at 5 months, you would vaccinate when other vaccines are given at 6 or 9 months, and using it that way, and considering it for seasonal boosting in areas where malaria transmission is seasonal. So I presented the models that are out there. We don't yet have models that I know of that look at use outside of the EPI schedule.
I mean, I'm not against. I mean, to me that's like, I mean, it's common, I'm not modern. It's sort of common sense when you see the number of cases you save, as opposed to intensity. That in CI, you could make a good case for introducing it into using the more traditional approach of vaccinating, probably be at 6-9 months, something else. They probably need 2 doses outside the current EPI schedule, but using the same sort of approach there, and it would be highly cost effective to do that. You wouldn't do that in Kalifi. I mean, it would be, the cost per Dali would be really enormous. So I think the intensity of the infection really has to be a very big driver. And they're not, fortunate, there are not so many areas now like CI actually. I mean, and in Tanzania, if you were thinking of introducing in Tanzania, I'm not sure how many areas you do that. So it is going to come to, I mean, we discussed a little bit yesterday, the idea of regional vaccination. And we have an example of Manafrivac has made that decision that countries like Nigeria, and there must have been a lot of political debate in Nigeria. If your state was just in the level that didn't get vaccinated, I'm sure there's some difficult political decisions there. So like in Kenya, I'm sure if it decides to do this, we'll not implement it into the EPI in Kenya. We'll have areas in which you might do that. Other areas you might keep it for an epidemic. Mm. So I think we just have to be more imaginative.
So we'll go Mark.
Okay. With regard to the blunting effect seen with the RTSS boosters, what do we know about the immune response to normal seasonal malaria? Has anybody measured CSP responses over time in exposed populations?
Yes, and it's not very immunogenic actually. I mean, the levels that you have to, the RTSS gives colossal titers. I mean, people said that 5% of your B cells or something are making anti-CSP antibody, and one wonders how healthy that is. So you really have to drive that response, and in natural immunity you don't get that, anything like that, the same titers. And in fact, some people, even exposed over many years, have virtually no antibody. They may have a T cell response to CSP. So it's not a particularly immunogenic, and you don't really get boosting, unfortunately, from natural 10 sporozoites. Injected doesn't give you a boost.
Right, so a follow-up question to that. What do we know about T cell immunity to RTSS boosting? Because there are a number of other diseases where you see blunting of antibody responses with repeated vaccination, but you actually develop a robust T cell response.
Yeah, I don't think it's been fully explored, and those are obviously hard studies to do. There was a subset, right, in the RTSS where 200 of the first subjects in each of the sites were enrolled, and some cells were collected, and that analysis has just started in terms of looking at T cell responses. But I
think it must be, because Matt mentioned if you get a variation mutation and that's in the TH2R T cell epitope, and the data was presented earlier this year, which showed actually the increasing. I mean, there was actually a sort of linear relationship between the number of mutations in the T cell and efficacy. And by the time you had 5 mutations away from the fate, the efficacy had largely gone. So that really, I mean, but the antibodies are still, in those people, still the same. So I think that makes a very strong case that actually the T cell response is more important than we may have thought. It's not just antibody.
Yeah. So
really interesting set of presentations. I think picking up on the modeling issue, I'm a little concerned that in order to get the cost effectiveness analysis right, you actually have to have the dynamic modeling right, and I'm wondering if that's actually, if we're there yet, I guess is really the question. I think the interactions with the vector, the issues with rebound, all the questions that were previously asked really make me think that there's some serious iteration needed on the transmission modeling that's used to support the cost effectiveness analysis. And I think that it's important in the context of presenting the first results that are out, which I see those as a first look. You have to walk before you run, you have to run before you, all those things. But I think that part of the challenge may be the messaging could become much more complicated here. And really what was in the first presentation was that there might be a portfolio of strategies that would be considered in the context of using all the tools. And we would have the economic analysis to look at all those and what the role of the vaccine might be in the context of that. And it might look really different in different countries with different settings. And I think the results you might get might be very different if you have a static analysis or an analysis that really just looks very short term than if you actually have an analysis that really looks at the dynamics appropriately. So I would just say I think it's important to provide some caution here that in fact we have some preliminary look at the cost effectiveness that suggests that there some room here, but in reality there's probably the results probably look as variable as malaria looks in the world, and there are some differences in terms of the experiences with different countries, with the dynamics of the disease, with the just all these things, and I think it's a much more complicated space that we are maybe not giving due justice to the complexity at this point. So, but I think this is the time to start to talk about it. So again, I'm not trying to be overly critical. I'm just trying to say this is the time to start to talk about the complexity in a more sophisticated way so that in fact we're getting people to think about the right questions and doing the analyses that actually need to get done to support the decisions better, I think. So I'm trying to be helpful, but, but I think I'm a little worried about the way the cost effectiveness analysis may have been done. Again, I haven't looked at it closely enough, but the interactions with the vector are, I think, something that has to really get factored in.
So maybe just to add on to that, and something that that Brian alluded to in his introduction, and we agreed we might bring it up in this discussion, is that beyond mortality and beyond direct disease, so mortality in untreated is somewhere around 15% in epidemic transmission and maybe just about 10% in high transmission. But with $2 billion worth of investment, we can drive that down. But beyond that, malaria parasites by one or more of 5 species associated with malnutrition. It's associated with effects on school performance and cognitive impairment across all spheres, language, attention, memory, executive functions, particularly associated with severe and cerebral malaria. Susceptibility or association with other pathogens such as non-typhoidal salmonella, right, and risk there. Interactions between HIV and the risk of malaria infection. This is particularly true during pregnancy and the effect of being HIV positive and pregnant and getting malaria. And then finally, just the economic costs, which the US CDC estimated that the direct costs have been estimated to be about $12 billion per year. And then loss in terms of economic growth could obviously is on top of that. So the question is so how do we capture that value as we do phase 3 studies and as we do pilot implementation programs, and that's ready to really get to the potential true full value of these vaccines. I'll throw it out to you guys first and then to the crowd.
I don't think either of us we came to a modelling, a modelers that, but I sometimes get newspapers to review and things. So I have to know a little bit about it. I mean, this is very straightforward, simple modelling, and I think, and the indirect effects have not been taken into account for that. I mean, no, those are. I mean, when we first did sort of successful malaria studies with bed nets, we found the mortality was actually reduced by double the amount that we thought was due to malaria. And when you looked at the causes, it was children with diarrhea and pneumonia and so on and things. So there are all those indirect effects. We know a little bit more about that now because very elegant work has been done in Kilifi in Kenya with relationship with sickle cell tray and things, which shows very slightly complicated, but it shows very strongly that malaria is a risk factor for invasive bacterial infections. And then we have the malnutrition, and then people are much more, as malaria has gone down, the peak incidence is going into school children, and people are much more interested now in malaria in school children, the effect of that, and so on. I mean, how you bring all those things into your model is going to, and that will vary, as you say, that will vary a lot from area, even in the same country. So the whole thing is much more difficult than just doing a sort of global effect of cost effectiveness of what he said. I mean, it's helpful to show that we're in the right sort of ballpark, but I think I agree. I mean, it's much more detailed work.
And just to add to that, I think there are ways that we can be better at our modeling, and the model is only as good as the data that is put into the model. And as we think of the implementation studies that are currently happening and future studies are being planned, we can think about different pieces of data that we would want to add to the data set for future modeling exercises that could actually help with precision, and think about some of these indirect effects, whether it be non-typhoidal salmonella infections, antibiotic use, and other factors, educational attainment, that we can think about collecting in vaccinees as ways to enhance our modeling techniques.
Follow up. So I think in the context of what you just said with respect to the additional data that are needed, I would really encourage you to also be thinking about the communication aspect of this, because of course we're talking about it in the context of other interventions. First of all,
Right.
You raised the idea of risk compensation, or the idea that people might do something different because they have a different perception about what the vaccine is doing, et cetera. And I think there's a rich literature in risk compensation that might be helpful to you in terms of understanding how people make those trade-offs. But the most important thing there is to actually have some data to show behavior. So if in fact people are talking about it already, designing that into the studies and doing the communication work that needs to be done up front is a critical piece here for that.
Raymond.
Yeah, just to provide more information on that study you referred to for Swiss tropical, as this was prepared actually for the SAGE discussions last year. And so, in fact, these were, we had static, we had dynamic models. It was presented also to the IVREC committee at WHO before it went to the SAGE discussion. So, to answer Kim's question, yes, we looked at these kind of transmission dynamics. But having said that, it was a lot of assumptions went into this. And so also to answer Ula's question, this was, we assumed that, the vaccine would be, just provided through the EPI system, and we didn't go into, outside the EPI system, but just as an exercise for going from these efficacy trials to, the public health impact of the vaccine, assuming that it would go to the EPI system. But what I just want to add is that yes, we need to go more into detail now, and also have more collecting data alongside these the coming trials. And to answer you, not to answer, but I was wondering, with regard to the broader benefits, what can we learn from other malaria preventive interventions in order to, pick up, the full effects of the malaria vaccine, not in order to reinvent the wheel. Or the data might already be there in terms of cost savings. I'm sure that in the malaria field there must be similar studies on the broader benefits or impact of other malaria interventions, and perhaps there is data and ideas to borrow from.
I can give. The literature on this is very scanty. It's very spotty, and some people have shown something on work efficiency, and studies in school children. Some people found cognitive things not. So it really is very spotty. But there are effects. Some people have found. So by chance, I found a paper looking for something else the other day, which somebody had got hold of the data that we did on the seasonal chemo prevention study, and I think they would use it as their PhD thesis. And it was very interesting. Much more sophisticated analysis than we could do 20 years ago. And in fact, people stayed at school. People who'd had chemo prevention for 5 years stayed at school if they were in secondary school for 1 year longer. So a really important indirect effect that we sort of thought of looking for. So I think we really do need more people in these, looking at these, some of these indirect effects. When you're doing an efficacy trial, all the regulators want to know is, does it stop malaria? Is it safe? You know, and I think when we're going into these more pilot implementations, we should be looking much more broadly.
Richard. Does this vaccine have any use in hepatitis B control?
It's actually in the label, but only for in malaria and
It's the best hepatitis B
Oh my gosh, the titers are astronomical.
Sorry?
The titers are astronomical.
So why is this not included in your benefit analysis?
I don't know if you want to take that, but
Well, the kids still get their routine hepatitis.
Exactly, they've
You know,
already
I mean,
gotten
could we drop their ordinary, their usual? So they're actually getting six injections of hepatitis B vaccine.
and because it's not going to be envisioned to be used in the infant EPI schedule, then there'll be a gap between the time they get their first shot.
Some of the trials were within adults, with women and so on.
Not yet. Only one.
Yeah.
Two, one in 10. So it hasn't been used much outside the children. I mean, the hope was it would go into the EPI. You'd give it with the EPI vaccines and everywhere. If it had 80% efficacy that lasted 5 years, I think that's what would have happened. But I think we have to think again of other approaches.
Okay, so we should, in the interest of time, we should probably move on to dengue. There is a common communication, I think, topic between the malaria vaccines and dengue, and one of this has to do with something that's been dubbed the rebound effect. And I think this is an important communication topic because I think what we're seeing here is not what we saw with formalin inactivated RSV, which is a real true safety signal. This looks more like waning efficacy, and as Brian, I think, alluded to, the expected epidemiologic shift in peak incidence of disease by providing some protection against this. But let's move on. Yep, absolutely.
I'd just like to make, I mean, if people are not familiar with it, I mean, no, I think we've had a useful discussion about how these vaccines might be used. 6 weeks ago, it was quite likely that we'd have had no RTSS because the international community couldn't come up with $20 million to do these implementations. I don't know how long did it take. 6 months.
It took us a year.
Hard work to that. So I think there is a lesson, and I don't know what the company would have done, but my guess is they would have stopped making RTS, and we'd have had no vaccine to think about that. So I think that is a real issue, was alluded to yesterday, that with these more difficult vaccines and more complicated things, we're going to need sort of big phase 4 pilot implementations, and it's not clear who's going to pay for those.
Yep.
So
And
I think
literally a second valley of death for these vaccines, particularly ones that are going to be implemented only in low resource settings, and so there's not a high income country market to drive some of that work. Absolutely, it was quote unquote a nail biter. All right, so we should move on to dengue, and Joao Sequeira from the Institute of Tropical Pathology and Public Health, as well as an adjunct professor at the Federal University and formerly an advisor to the Brazil Ministry of Health on routine surveillance activities on training and outbreak, and particularly for dengue fever, will